We do want to take a breath, come into this space together, and start with a land acknowledgement. The summit is virtual and folks are participating from many lands in this space today. We acknowledge the land that the Cascade Bicycle Club headquarters sits on as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose lands you're on, look in the chat in a minute and you'll see a link to the map you can use to look up your place on the land. Without these communities, we all would not have access to this environment. We take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. And unfortunately for my tech glitches at the beginning, we are recording this session and it will be available following the summit. The summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, two sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington state, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding events and rides. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We want to take a minute to thank our sponsors, whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 15 panels over this week with expert speakers, and registration is free for all attendees. So thank you to our sponsors, Amazon and the Washington State Department of Transportation. And I'm now so pleased to hand it off to Dara Baldwin, who is the Director of National Policy with the Center for Disability Rights. Dara's keynote session is going to address the cross-section or the intersection of disability rights, racial justice, and political action within active transportation. So join us now for Dara to break down how safety, equity, and accessibility show up or do not show up in our systems, and what we can be doing to build communities that work for everyone. So Dara, take it away, thank you. And one more, sorry, my apologies. One more piece to note is our format today, that we have this introduction, Dara's comments, and then a Q&A that you can drop into the chat. And you're welcome to drop those questions in at any point. Just a reminder that you would have gotten our community norms via email. And if at any point you feel that those norms for creating a brave space are not being followed, you can contact somebody who has an asterisk on their name in the participant list. Thanks so much. And Dara, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Barb and Tamar, Wendy, and everyone else. And thank you to Cascade for having me here for this wonderful Washington Bike Walk Roll Summit. I just want to say before I start that I love Washington State and wish we could travel, because I would be right there with you guys, all up and down the state. You name a city, I love it. So I am honored to be here. My name is Dara Baldwin. I am Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights. We are what's called a CIL, a Center for Independent Living, CIL. Those are non-residential centers where people with disabilities go for services, for outreach, for camaraderie, for fellowship, and for advocacy. My CIL, the Center for Disability Rights, is headquartered in Rochester, New York. We have 7 facilities throughout the state, but I live and work in Washington, D.C. I have to say, D.C. statehood, DC statehood, DC statehood, on everything I'm on, the other Washington, as they say. And then we are on Piscataway and Anacostia land, so I must give honor to them and to the indigenous people who really own this land. And finally, I use she, her pronouns. So I'm glad to be here and have this conversation with you all. I hope you're enjoying this summit. It is so nice to see the word roll in a title when we talk about accessibility. I've been doing this work for almost 15 years. And doing transportation work for over 20 years. And I can, just recall trying to get that word in. Everyone's a walkable. And I was like, well, not everybody walks. Some people are rollable. So it's so good to see the right change. So I want people to know, I want to say thank you to all of you out there for the work you do every single day. And know that there is change, right? Like when I started this work, I never would have saw roll in the title. Now we see it. So thank you for that and for people to see that. So I'm going to talk about disability and disability work, and as we had in the agenda, and I'll go through it. So the Center for Disability Rights comes from a place and works from the framework of disability justice. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But disabilities and the laws that protect it are the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is the primary one. And what that says is many people think is about doors and ramps and accessibility. That is a part of the ADA. Actually, that is the Architectural Barrier Act of 1968 really told people to do that. What the ADA did was gave people with disabilities a civil and human right. And the premise of the ADA is that community integration. That means that people with disabilities can and should live in a community, no matter what their disability is, they can and should be in the community. And where does that come from? A lot of people have never heard of these, but they're called the Ugly Laws. In 1876, San Francisco was the first city to have the Ugly Laws. And what the Ugly Laws said were, if you had a disability, you could not be in public spaces. And so from that, in our country and around the world, these laws actually went around the world. So, you know, they're actually still in existence in some countries like Russia, like some of the Eastern European countries, where they still institutionalize people. What happened further was that FDR and the New Deal, which is considered to be a racist and ableist policy, he continued that and actually moved that into institutionalizing people with disabilities. So that when people gave birth to a child with a disability, usually those you can see at birth, like Down syndrome or developmental disabilities, immediately, they put them right into institutions. And so we work from a space of getting them out of institutions. And so what's part of that? The chicken before the egg: housing, education, transportation. And so I work very closely on transportation policy issues. So that's the disability, and that's where we come from in that space, that yes, it's about accessibility, but it's about community integration. And then what I talked about disability justice, disability rights community truly centers white folks. And has done so for years. And after so many years of trying to work with the community, many young, queer, Black, Indigenous people of color who were disabled came together and said, we're going to create our own space and our own way to do this work. Now, this happens in a lot of social justice movements, right? You have environmental justice, right, which really centers Black and brown and Indigenous fighters and people who've been fighting for the land for many, many years. And you have climate change, right, and climate justice or climate movement, and that's two different movements. You have this in reproductive justice. Reproductive justice is usually Black, Indigenous women who are doing reproductive justice, and then you have abortion rights. They're separate. It's horrible to see, but many Black and brown people have been tired of pushing and trying to get involved or get their voices heard in other areas, and so they moved on. Disability justice has 10 principles. The first is intersectionality, and the 10th is collective liberation. You will never see the disability rights community do 1 through 10. So that's where we come from, that space. And also disability justice, we are set to remove and erase racism and any systems of oppression. And when we say intersectionality, that means that there is a person, an African-American transgender woman who is a refugee, formerly incarcerated, and has a disability. And all of these things come together when we're talking about this work. So that's what disability justice is, and that's the space in which I come from when I do transportation work. So let me move to transportation. I am here at the Transportation Equity Caucus, kind of how I met Barb and Wendy and Tamar and many people on this call, and many of you in Washington. I'm thankful that you're part of the Equity Caucus. You're more than welcome to join the Equity Caucus. They'll put the link to the Equity Caucus in the chat box. Thank you, Tamar and Wendy. It is free. You just have to look at our principles, say you wish to join, you agree with those principles, and we'll talk to you, and then you can join us. But anyway, the Transportation Equity Caucus is co-chaired with the policy link. It started over years ago by Black women who for years, and what many people don't know or understand is that the civil rights movement started from transportation, got its foundation in transportation. In the 1955-56 Montgomery bus boycott, which was started by young Black women, not just Rosa Parks, right? There were 15 of them, started the movement. They said, we're not going to take the bus. They did the bus boycott for 386 days. They refused to take public transportation in Montgomery till they received their civil and human rights to ride the bus where they wished to sit on the bus. Had a Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court case was won. Once that happened on December 28, 1956, Dr. Martin Luther King himself got on the Montgomery bus and said, okay, the bus boycott is now over, and let us start the civil rights movement. And so transportation is key to everyone's life, right? It is also key to disabled people's lives. And so that is also where you'll see, if you've heard of the group ADAPT, ADAPT took over Mitch McConnell's office to help fight the ACA in 2017. ADAPT got its start in transportation. The first movements for ADAPT were throwing their bodies, putting chains on buses and saying, you're going to make these buses accessible. So transportation is very key in civil and human rights movements. And many of us came together about 10 years ago to say, you know, a lot of civil rights groups weren't touching transportation in this way. And so urban planners, some engineers, some public health people, there's a lot of people, researchers, all in transportation equity. And so that's what we got together and we said, we want to address equity. Those of you who do transportation and traffic safety know of the 5 E's, right? The education, encouragement, engineering, enforcement, and evaluation. I still don't understand encouragement, but okay, I didn't get that one. But anyway, the 5 E's. We used to push and say, you need to include equity, the E of equity. And we meaning Black women, mostly Black women. There are some Black men out there who are doing this, but mostly Black women, like Tamika Butler, like Anita Harrison now, and Lexa Kwame and Veronica, many of us were pushing this and saying equity needs to be included. And we were laughed at. We were told we're angry Black women. We were pushed out to say, you know, equity is not needed in this. We do social justice. Social justice will seep into the work that we do. We were also told, you know, many of us will let people know, just like in disability work, those people who are closest to the problem are closest to the issue and the solutions. You will not create an accessible transportation system if you don't have disabled folks sitting or wheeling up to your table, because you cannot resolve those problems because you are an able-bodied person or non-disabled person, as we say. And so therefore you can't resolve those problems. And it's the same for Black, Indigenous people of color. It's the same for people who have low socioeconomic status. And you had a lot of people sitting around those tables making decisions that were not engaging with the communities, that did not look like our communities. They were mostly white folks sitting at table making white decisions. And one of them is about safety and what safety means. And so one of them was about not including equity, because they felt like, well, we'll do that. And we were letting them know that's not true. And as many of us are calling it, the reckoning of the summer of 2020 with the horrific killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many others has shown what racism is, and that racism is very much still much alive in even quote unquote progressive social justice movements. One of them being transportation. And so what the Transportation Equity Caucus embarked on was a conversation about what equity means to us and to people of color, and what the enforcement of those 5 E's has done to us and our community. So let me talk about equity. Equity is fair and impartial. That means that if you set up a program, whatever the program may be, it is fair. Everyone can use it no matter what. It's not equality. Equality is something different. I don't want to be equal to someone. I don't need to be equal. I need to be who I am, a Black, proud woman, and still get and receive all of the things that someone, you know, who's an Indigenous woman receives. We don't want to be equal. We just want to receive the same things. We're not equal. Our experiences are not equal. And so when you do equity, you want to sit around tables that are, you know, full of many voices so that you can come to those equitable solutions. Right? We also don't believe that there's a problem that no one can fix. I always hear that, oh, we just can't do that. And then finally, within equity, as I said, you had the 5 E's. And it was interesting to see within the transportation, urban planning community, things have been done the same for 30 plus years, and people don't want to change. And we have to start with that. We have to start and show you have to have change, and that the way in which things were being done were harmful and killing Black, Indigenous people of color. And we need it to stop. And the only way these things are going to stop is if you start opening your minds to different solutions. And the same thing happens when it comes to disabled people in the community. Like I said earlier, never would have had the word role in the title until someone said, no, we have to change that. We have to be inclusive, right? We never would have the conversations about what does it mean to be accessible and to have a truly accessible system, not just the bus being accessible, but the bus station where the people have to come, or the bus stop, right? Right, or the curb cuts that are there, or even making sure that the bus stop and the bus station, when it snows, that is, plowed correctly. You don't put all the snow in front of the curb cut, right? That is the system. That is a whole entire system, right? When people pay, that they're able to put their hands in their fingers, if they don't have dexterity, to put the money in or to use a card and tap. It is an entire system that needs to be accessible, not just the one product, the bus. And you're not going to have that if you don't have those voices at the table. It's not going to be equitable. We want you to create something that's equitable, and you don't have to start all over again. A last system I'll talk about that we still is not equitable, we don't have, is bicyclists, because you are talking about biking in your summit. There's one bike lane in the country that I know of, and I travel the country and talk to a lot of people around the country. It's in Queens, New York, that is accessible to disabled folks. Disabled people ride tricycles and hand bikes, and their wheelbase is wider than a two-wheel bike. And so when it comes to safety for our people, they have to, especially out in DC. I was the ADA compliance specialist. I worked for the mayor right here, 11 months. That's all. I am not a government worker. That I learned. But they didn't listen to me when they were setting up the bike lanes. And I was like, this is a violation of Title II of the ADA. Title II of the ADA says if you create a program for one group of people, it must be for all. And that is equity. That's right. And so the bike lanes are people in Washington, D.C. I have friends who ride tricycles. They can't be in the bike lane. They're on Pennsylvania Avenue. Their partner or whoever, their children who ride two-wheel bikes are in the bike lane, and they're on the outside. Because if they ride on a bike lane, they take up 2 lanes, and which is dangerous for people coming the other way. Okay. Also, the bike programs. If you want to come to DC and you want to ride city bikes, not if you're disabled. We don't have tricycles. We don't have hand bikes. That system was created, and it wasn't equitable. That's not fair nor impartial. And so we still have these issues and concerns around biking, around all of these areas of transportation, about active transportation. The scooters people use, I'm working with Lime and all of them, and they're like, oh, well, granted, right, maybe a blind person who's blind or hard of, low vision may not use a scooter, that's fine, but their son might want to use a scooter. And the way in which, or their child, the way in which they pay for it, you had to go on these CVS's and into these machines that were not accessible. That was the system. Just because that person is blind and they may not use it doesn't mean that their family member won't, and that they're the ones paying for it. We need to be equitable and fair about how you set up systems. And you wouldn't have known that because you don't talk to this community and you don't know what's going on. Right? So there lies behind. And just so you know, those machines where you pay aren't accessible, not only to people who have low vision and blind, but also to people who have dexterity issues, because you have to stick your credit card in there. You see how I'm moving my hand and pinching? They can't do that. If you're a paraplegic or someone who has any kind of muscle issues, you might be able to get your card in, they won't be able to get it out. They also can't punch those buttons. That's why ATMs are not accessible to our people. These are systems that are set up, and these are things that we tell people you need to think about, right? Even when buying a bus card, some of those machines are not accessible to our people. That's not equity. Okay, now I'm going to move to E of enforcement. We tried for years to push back on programs like Vision Zero, who centered enforcement in everything they did. We got to call the police will be there. If you do this, if you ticket people, they will act right. This country was based on a punitive system, and a punitive system specifically to harm Black bodies. Indigenous bodies, and people of color bodies. And if you don't believe me, I'm sure you've seen the scenes of what happened down there at that border around Black Haitian immigrants and how those horsemen, I've done work on the border and done work with immigration for years with mostly, right, Latinx, right? But I have done some immigration, of course, around, people from Africa and different areas, because I also work in New York, right? They're coming through JFK or through Newark, New Jersey, or Pennsylvania, Philly, or even Canada. I've never seen those horsemen, and I've never seen them been used like that. But for Black bodies, they were. And so when you talk about enforcement, you talk about this country, many white folks in this country, it has to be said, and you need to understand it comes from slavery. That if you punish them, if you beat them, if you do things to them, they will act right. And that small and horrible, horrific ghost has trickled their way all the way to 2021, where people still believe if you punish people, they'll act right. And that has not worked for 30-something years. And in traffic violations and traffic safety, you still have the same problems when people have provided information around the engineering of roads, how roads are set up, the process of not speaking to a community when you set up a road. That is the system. Have meetings with them, let people know there are other ways in which to get people to not speed through your community, to not harm people in your community, than to punish them, than to give them a ticket, than to say you're doing wrong and we're going to get you. That is not how you resolve problems. We want to resolve problems through community and love, through care and love. And if you are that way with people, you will see that things change. So I said, right, enforcement. And we all, for years, many of us, right, in transportation equity were saying, no, this is killing us. This is connected to Black Lives Matter before Black Lives Matter even got started. And then it was proven through the data. If you look at the consent decree that came from Ferguson, Missouri, where the killing of Michael Brown happened. If you look at the consent decree, Baltimore, Maryland, where Freddie was killed, you will see in the consent decree, and which is like an evaluation of the process and the system, it was traffic violations that killed Black and Brown folks in those places and around the country. NPR report, DOJ report shows that at a higher rate, at the highest rate, so it's 25 to 27%, when Black people specifically are pulled over by police, are harmed or killed, it is through a traffic violation. 27% of them are through traffic violations. And so we in transportation, we're trying to tell people this. We're like, okay, look, not just the transportation community, we were also telling the civil rights community, right? Like you need to look at transportation. There's a problem here around this E of enforcement. And so we were ignored, as I said before, angry Black women, you don't know what you're talking about. Race isn't involved in everything. This isn't happening with us in our programs. We do things right. If you do it right, there's many times people tell me, especially around automated enforcement, which I'll talk about in a minute, if you do it right, that won't happen. So I go back to the words of equity. I said fair and impartial. If you set up a program that is fair and impartial, you don't have to worry if you do it right or wrong. Because if you do it, it's fair and impartial. But when you try to do things that are equality or things that you think are going to be correct, you have to think about who does it and when they do it and if they do it correctly. So we pushed back on enforcement, pushed back specifically on Vision Zero and how it was planned and set up and how it is being implemented around the country. Many people try to say, but law enforcement isn't the problem. You just have a few bad apples. That may be true. Look, in every profession, even in social justice work, where people don't want to believe, there are people who have no business being in social justice work. They just as racist as the racists I'm fighting every single day. They don't want to admit that to themselves. They think they're a little better because they're doing social justice work, but that's not true. There are doctors, right, and nurses who take the Hippocratic oath, do no harm, but yet they still do harm. You name a profession, there are people who are doing well in the profession and people who are not. It is the system. It is the system of policing that is wrong. In the chat box, Tamara, if you could put in the history of law enforcement. It's an article from the New Yorker. This is just one of them, but you can read about why law enforcement was created in this country. They were slave patrols. They were sent out to harm Black bodies, not just when, because people think only when the enslaved ran away. That's not true. Those slave patrols were also used in the form, as I was saying, about punishment, where they used to whip the enslaved people in front of the others and say, this is what will happen to you if you do these things. If you try to get married, if you try to have a child without the master saying so. And you need to understand and know that. And if you don't understand that, again, go watch those images of what happened down in Texas. That is exactly what happened. They put, and then when someone discussed with these men on these horses, or when it was discussed with the director of Department of Homeland Security, the secretary, they said, oh, they didn't use whips, they used the horses to block the people, as if that was better, as if that was something different. That is what we're talking about, is that when you use the system of enforcement, it is harmful to Black and brown people, Indigenous people of color, at a higher rate. It is specifically set up to protect white bodies. And so when you use enforcement, any type of enforcement, remember, it's doing harm to Black, Indigenous people of color. That is the system. It is a system that is not based on equity. It is not based on being fair and impartial. And so that's why we push to remove equity. If you go to the Transportation Equity Caucus website, you will see we did a 3-part series just on what I was just talking about. One is, what is the history of law enforcement and what does that look like in transportation? The second webinar was on what is currently happening right now. The first one, my cohort, my co-chair Axel Santana, who I love at Policy Link, he moderated that one. I moderated the second one. And we had a disability justice, Carrie Gray, on to talk about Black Disabled Lives Matter, and Breon Wells, who's the president and CEO of the Daily Initiative, to talk about what is happening now in policing and how is that connected to transportation, right? I made the connection between that and transportation. And that if you think your work in transportation is not connected to the work around law enforcement and like the Justice and Policing Act that we're trying to get passed in Congress, that we're trying to end qualified immunity, that we're trying to end the 1033 program, which is police officers having military products, think again, because they are all connected. And then the final webinar number 3, was on the future. What do we do in the future? So what I was saying, I'm from Newark, New Jersey. I was born in Spain. My parents were serving their country and brought me home to their home city, which is Newark. And Newark, New Jersey has what's called the street teams. And you will see the founder, he's on our webinar, talking about what we did in the city of Newark. And I say we because I'm still kind of, I go home and help out. But they created street teams that, so Newark is broken up in wards, so like 8 different wards. And in each ward, the community got together and they picked their own community teams. Some people are formerly incarcerated. Actually, the founder is formerly incarcerated and came home and wanted to change the system. And they, before the pandemic, walked children back and forth to school, right? To make sure that they could get back and forth to school. They walked around the community, making sure the community was okay. I say all this to say, these are ways in which you can do things without law enforcement. What happened in the city of Newark, Mayor Ras Baraka decided to move those funds and move enforcement out of the police department and into what is called the Department of Public Safety. That is run by someone who's a clinician who knows about public safety and mental health safety and all of those things. So it's a 10-year plan to see, right, like removing the police out of doing certain things. One of them is traffic stops. They do not do traffic stops in Newark unless, you're 100 miles an hour or something very egregious. They are not involved in the community with picking up people or patrolling. They don't do that anymore in Newark. And if you don't know, and the things I'm talking about, I'm sorry I didn't say this, on our webinars, when you click on our website, you can click on the webinar, there is a resource sheet Everything I'm talking about is on those resource sheets, like the NPR report, the DOJ report. You can go to that and click on there. This information is on the third webinar 3, what I'm talking about to you here about North Street teams. They have a whole website and everything, what they did. And so what they have decided is they won't have patrols. So 2 things are very important for people to know, and why people are trying to use this North Street teams model within their cities. During the summer of 2020, when you had Black Lives Matter protests, we had them in Newark. Newark is the only city where there was not one office building, restaurant, business was destroyed or harmed in rioting. We had no rioting in that city. 2 was there was not one arrest, because the police were not there. It was the street teams who organized and said, okay, what time you guys are going to be out? Okay, we'll be here. They stood around, they watched. It was the community who came out to tell the government, as you can by your First Amendment right, what is wrong, what's going on. They protested, they did their rallies, they went home. Things can be done differently with no law enforcement around. The second thing was, in the year 2020, not one Newark police officer pulled their weapon out to use and shoot or fire. So things are working because they weren't patrolling. They weren't in our neighborhood. They weren't in the neighborhoods and streets. So when people say, oh, this can't happen, I don't listen to people who say can't. I go around you and say, let me find people who say can. If Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and all the rest of them, what's his name? Steve Jobs, listen to people who say, oh, you could never do that. You can't do that. I would never have this iPhone right here, because they just wouldn't have done. They wouldn't have tried. That's not how you get to solutions. That's not how you get to innovation. That's not how you get to changing people's lives. So a lot of stuff you have to forget what you learned, right? And start over. I will tell you, I came into disability in 2009. I came from a family full of disabled folk. My grandmother was disabled. She helped with the ADA. And I still had to learn new things. I had to say, oh, I didn't know these things could actually happen. Okay. And sit and be with the community and learn. That is the only way in which people think I'm an expert, and that's their language, fine, but that I understand and know. And I say they because I don't have a disability, but they consider me part of the family, right? Because I've been around so long. The same thing with my LGBTQ folks. I'm not gay, but they're like, oh, Dara, you family, you've been around too long to help us and everything else. And I learned. I didn't understand and know what it meant to be transgender. I didn't know what non-binary. And I went and I learned. I took my classes, and I go and I talk with those communities. That is the only way we were going to make change in this world. You can't keep sitting in your offices or thinking that because you have this plan, it works. It doesn't work. If you don't have community, if you don't have the people who are closest to the problem, your product is wrong. I tell people all the time, if you're creating something and it's a homogeneous table, if it's all white folks, if it's all Christians, if it's all people from the urban area, not people from the rural area, it's wrong. Whatever y'all creating is wrong. You're gonna have to start all over again. Not only that, but you're causing harm to a community who does not deserve to be harmed anymore. And enforcement is really doing that. I really want to bring up automated enforcement, because here's right, people, oh, innovate, because I'm getting this now. Well, Dara, we're going to take away the law enforcement. We're right. We kind of understand that, because it's kind of, they still don't get that, which I understand. And I take that, right? Especially coming from a white person who I don't think will ever understand the fear of what law enforcement means to us. To Black folks, to Black Indigenous people of color. But anyway, so then they say, oh, we're gonna put these, automate enforcement. I'm like, oh, nope, hold on. The other thing when it comes to intersectionality, it's not just your marginalizations, right? Or being multi-marginalized, meaning, right, disabled, queer, refugee, formerly incarcerated. But then also our issues, the things we work on. I work on about 14 different issue areas, and they are all connected in some way. So let me give you an example. People say, oh, automated enforcement, this is do with this. So first of all, it's kind of like what happened in Afghanistan. And people say, well, what was our goal in Afghanistan? And no one still can tell us what was the goal. So then therefore everything was a failure. I ask people, what's your goal around automated enforcement? To punish people. To punish them into acting right. I mean, that hypothesis just doesn't make sense at all. I mean, if you have children, or I don't have any kids, but I got nieces and nephews and plenty of godchildren, and I know just you can't make a child do what you want. You can't make your partner do, like, that doesn't work. If it doesn't work in your circle, your social life, what makes you think it works in the fuller community? That because I punish you, you're going to do something better. Doesn't work that way. So when you set up these cameras, most of the time they're 360 cameras. I don't understand that either, because they should be going towards the license plate, whatever. That doesn't make sense either. So one, the Fourth Amendment and surveilling our bodies. The ACLU, we work very closely with the ACLU, with National Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers. Actually, they just have a report out, which I'll get to you, Tamar, about surveilling and how using surveillance and law enforcement using surveillance is against our Fourth Amendment right and our privacies. Those cameras are picking up stuff. Where's that data going? Who is in control of that data and who protects that data? Who allows whoever wants to come in and use that data for whatever they want? And how is that data destroyed? I can't get answers to these questions because nobody knows the answers, but they showed what they knew was it was a solution to this, but they didn't care about these things because that data question harms Black examples. One is, if you're a mother of 3 and the mother drives past that street every day to drop her kids off at the babysitter or the daycare, and that camera always picks her up as she's speeding, but it's not her, it's the car behind her or the car in front of her, she gets a ticket. Because she doesn't have paid leave off, see, the other issues I work on, you need paid leave, she can't take off to go fight that ticket, to go and say, I didn't do this. Why? Because court systems are open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Maybe one night is late a week, but she can't do that because she got her kids. Like, nobody can take care of her kids, and she's not bringing her kids to the court. They offer a class. Oh my God, we're going to give you a class. So and that class is offered Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Or even they say, oh, we got Saturday classes, Dara. Really, she has 3 kids. They probably got tap, ballet, jazz. She's trying to keep them kids busy and off the streets, or she's just trying to take care of her children. She don't have child care on Saturday. That's not going to work out for her. Now she hasn't paid. She's got 3 tickets. Now she's got a warrant out for her arrest. She gets pulled over by the police, especially if she's a Black woman. What did I just tell y'all? Right? 27% pulled over by police. If you haven't read Andrea Ritchie's book, Invisible No More, you need to understand and know what happens to women who are pulled over by the police. Right? Many women are assaulted, sexual assaulted, beaten up, all kinds of stuff happen to women pulled over by the police. Her book, Andrea Ritchie's book, is about queer, disabled women and trans women and non-binary people who are pulled over by the police. You need to read that and see what's going on there, right? So that happens to her. Or the mother, she's separating from her partner, and she wants custody of her children, and the partner somehow can get data that says, oh, you got a warrant out for your arrest, or you've got all these speeding tickets, you're doing all this stuff. This is an irresponsible person. She should not have those children. And the judge looks, I mean, that it's black and white on paper. You done got 15, 16 tickets. Why you keep getting all these speeding tickets? Because you right, but it's not her. They take her children. They give her children to her partner based on that data. No, and don't tell me this can't happen, because you don't know, because no one set up the guardrails. I don't know what the policies are. There are no principles around, no, we will not share this data. That has not been set up. So don't sit here and tell me that, oh, when you do it right, it works well, because the people who are saying do it right have no idea how it could do harm, because they ain't living those lives. They're not living those lives. So don't talk to me about it, right? And then people talk about even, I know New York, whatever, oh, it's only $35 out of the ticket's only $35. Those are privileged folks, because $35 to a lot of people is food for a week. If you haven't learned that through this COVID and this pandemic, I don't understand. $35 is a lot of money. That's diapers for children. That's some food for a kid. That's a child's outfit for 2-3 weeks. Don't talk to me about only $35. That's another thing. We have a whole program on the bail system, right? And fines and fees, because the bail system, do you know how many people are in prison, or sorry, in jail? Because jail is when you're not adjudicated. These are people who can't pay their bail, who couldn't pay a fine to their county. So they get locked up and put in jail. You lose your job, you haven't come to work, they don't know where you are, you lose your children, you can lose your housing, you can lose all kinds of stuff because you were put into jail for a fine. That was only $35, Dara, because these are people who are not close to those. They would never in their mind think about bail or any of those things because they don't live those lives. And they're not talking to people who live those lives. They're usually white privileged folks who don't have that. So when you talk to me about automated enforcement, don't be a white person who's living a white life, who hasn't gone out into the community and found out what is going on and how this can be harmful to other people. That is what we're talking about. Another thing about automated enforcement and those 360 cameras too, you could be, and I'm saying this where, you know, there could be a bar or any kind of a Planned Parenthood or something, and this person goes to that place all the time, or even Black Lives Matter. I'm always at the Black Lives Matter protest, and the camera's catching me. Then I get labeled terrorist because I'm at the Black Lives Matter. Don't act like, because we are, right? They don't label many of our people terrorists because they go to Black Lives Matter. Or you go into the bar a lot, and again, here we go. Your partner's trying to do something to you, or your boss is trying, and they get the data, and they say, oh, this person's not very, responsible because they're going to the bar every night. It don't matter why you're going to a bar. It's nobody's business. You can go there and just watch TV if you want to. Why are you taping it, and why is someone surveilling it, and why does someone have data to that information? Well, you could lose your job. You could lose your housing, you can lose your child, you can lose everything you have built up for your life, or even just trying, right? Most people just trying to stay above the water, and this camera has taken them and taken it away from them. So when people say, oh, automated enforcement is the cat's pajamas, or it's going to do this, don't do that, because you haven't talked to the community. That is just one solution you've come up with. There are many others, and I'll give an example. You could sit with the community, as I have seen happen. People, like I said, in my city in Newark, New Jersey, they sat down and they said, and actually San Francisco, other areas, they sit there and people are driving fast. They put up signs to say, slow down because there's children here. They ask the drivers, they say, listen, they give out pamphlets. You need to understand and know this is where kids go back and forth to the park or to the school, and we want you to slow down. And it has happened, and people look and say, oh, I didn't know that. I'm sorry, I was speeding. Let me slow down. Not punishing them, not telling them if you did it, because they look at the ticket, especially people who could afford a ticket. They're like, I'll pay the $35 and I'm still going to speed. And I'm not saying everyone's going to do that, but a majority of the community is going to look and say, okay, let me stop that. Having community meetings, having conversations is what drives change. So I say all that to say to you, in your work, as I said, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for what you're doing. But please remember these things I talked to you about. Remember disability justice. Remember racial justice. Remember the fact that we live in communities. If COVID hasn't shown you that, I know many of us, like myself, I'm not married, no kids, so I've been in the house by myself, right, isolated, but I know I'm not by myself. I live in a community. I live with people who care about me, who I care about. And that is how you should address and move your work, especially when it comes to transportation, because transportation touches every person's life. I don't care who they are or what they're doing, whether they're taking public transportation, active transportation, or driving a car, or walk. Like me, I don't own a car. I don't own any of those things. I walk and take trains and buses everywhere I go. So that is how we need to do this work. And we need to listen to Black, Indigenous people of color, and to people who are disabled, people who are closest to the problems are closest to the solution. So I want to thank everyone. I'm going to stop talking because I'm at my time. And I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Indeed, we are. This is Barb back with you again, and we've got a few questions in the chat. Please keep those coming. We've got about just under 10 minutes left to ask Dara some things. So I'll kick it off with one of the questions on the question of enforcement. My city has many white men who drive their huge pickups through crosswalks without stopping at red lights. What alternatives to enforcement do you use to address such public safety problems? And you described one with the neighborhood, but maybe expand on that a bit.
Oh, yeah. So you also education, right? Education does a lot for people. So in your city, and you just said full of white men, they probably are part of an organization, right? Or a lodge or something that's in your neighborhood. When we talk about community outreach, those are ways you can do that. You can find out all kinds of stuff happen, bowling night, whatever night it is going on. I used to do this around voting registering people to vote. I used to go to the bowling alley and sit out and say, hey, are you registered to vote? I used to go to the Pathmark, the supermarket, and go to the supermarket and sit with pamphlets and say, listen, this is what it means to speed through our neighborhood, and this is what's happening. There are all kinds of ways to do community outreach, and that's actually what community organizers do. If you talk to some community organizers, even if it's for white men, we still know how to talk to communities. It don't matter what color they are. It's the process and how you do it. And again, sometimes they're just not going to change their mind, and they're going to keep rolling through those stop signs. So now what you have to do is the other side of education. You have to educate the pedestrians. You have to say, listen, I know what they're supposed to do, but here, you need to pay attention. You need to, I look at people all the time, people think about cell phones in the car. That's a problem. Them cell phones, when people walk in, I have stopped so many people say, ho, they're just looking at their phone and about to step in the middle of the street. And I'm like, the light is green. Like, pedestrians also have to learn how to be pedestrians. So you do both kind of education.
Thanks. Another question was advice that you might have for asking people for help in transportation planning so that everyone is truly represented at the table. And I know it's a big topic, but maybe some starting points for people who want to go back and get a more representative table together.
Sure. No. So if you're looking for disabled folks specifically, I'll tell you should look up your CILs, and I'll put it in the chat box. It's the Centers for Independent Living. We have a ILRU. They're our research arm. They have a map, and you click on the map and you can find your CIL wherever you are. And I'll put it in the chat in a minute. But if you're looking for disabled people, I would contact your CIL, your Center for Independent Living, and tell them and say, hey, I want to have some disabled people in this conversation, those who know transportation, or those who know whatever you're talking about. They're there, believe me. And you have that conversation. The same thing goes for other groups. If you're looking for, people who are civic minded, then you're gonna go to civic groups. Hold on, I'm just putting in here. There you go, that's for CILs. That's the map, and you'll find it. Go to civic groups, go to your local YWCA, go to your Boys and Girls Club and say, hey, you're having meetings. What do you have? Can you have a meeting about transportation? I need to find out because you want youth, right, to be involved. You want their parents to be involved. I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, right? The sororities, I'm sure you all know, right? Kamala Harris is a member of AKAs. The sorority, the Divine Nine, which are all of our sororities and fraternities, that is our job. We are to be social justice folks. You can find those if you go to the websites of those organizations, the same kind of thing. You can find your chapter and in Spokane, Washington. Hey, there's a Spokane chapter of Delta Sigma Theta, and they do community outreach, and they have members who are interested in transportation reach, right? There are all kinds of ways. And the best are faith-based. The houses are faith-based. The mosques, the synagogues, the churches, and you have to go to the leaders, the imam at the mosque, right, the rabbi at the synagogue, and the pastor at the church, because that's who the community believes and trusts. And so tell them, we want to start this program, we want to talk about transportation, and then from there you will find leaders. I've done this for years. There's not one meeting I'm going to and not come away with 3-4 names of people who want to help out or have friends who want to help out. The last thing I also tell you is that most cities have an office of outreach, community outreach. Work with your community outreach team and say, hey, what are you doing this month? Are you doing anything about transportation? Are you doing anything about these conversations? We want to have this and we need your help. And again, remember, whatever you're doing has to be accessible to our people, to disabled people. So you want to make sure you have ASL interpreters. That's American Sign Language interpreters. You want to make sure you have information that is in large print for those who are have low vision, or if they need it in Braille, or if they need it in plain language, which means most of the things in this country are written at a 7th, 8th grade level. Even the newspaper is written at a 7th, 8th grade level. Sorry, some of them are written at a 4th or 5th grade level. But anyway, when we say plain language, is for people with developmental disabilities. So you would have to get to a 4th or 5th grade level. And the SILs that I was telling you about, many of them will help you write that. Or the ARCs, and the ARC in Washington, Wright State, that's the founding place. The ARC will sit down and rewrite your product so it's plain language, right? You probably are not going to use 3-syllable words in that document, is what I want to say, right? And it's and so that they can understand and engage. So there's all kinds of ways to engage with your communities.
I want to lift up Micah's comment about saying, as a blind person, I attempt hitting cars like that with my cane. Back to the white guy blasting the crosswalk. Still to this day, I've never been honked at. So thank you, Micah, for that.
I love it, Micah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciate Evan's question. And if you could speak a little bit in our last few minutes about making cycling more equitable. And I'm really struck by your point that bike lanes are not designed from starting with an accessibility width, but just in general, talking about that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So we've been lucky in the Transportation Equity Caucus. We have the League of American Bicyclists. They're part of our group, Karen Whitaker and them. They've been listening to us. We have managed, there's about 4 cities that I know of across the country. Detroit is one of them. College Park here in Maryland, because the mayor is a person with disability. Patrick is from our community, so he did it. Who changed their bicycle renting programs, and they have hand bikes and tricycles in them. And so that makes it accessible to all. Well, open to many. I won't say all, because there's still things you can do. But it's unfortunate those systems are already set in place. So now you're going to have to redo them. And so now when you start this process of doing this work, are the people you're talking to willing to invest that time and money to do that? I will tell you, here in Washington, D.C., we were told, no, they're not going to redo these bike lanes, and our people just going to have to be not safe. Now, we did our part. Now I send it, because people say, why don't you sue? I'm not a litigator. And even my litigators say, oh, you got to get enough information that, it's got to take time, and then say, okay, they purposely did this, and they're intentionally not helping people. So until, that's some serious conversations with your planners and your community to say, because they're going to have to do that all over. Right? They're going to have to measure. And people keep asking, what is the width? I don't know. I don't do that work. You want to talk to the Access Board. The Access Board is a board who sets those standards. Like when people say, oh, a door has to be 33 inches wide, that is who does that. And they will tell you, or they will work with you. They have the sheets and all that kind of stuff. There you go. I just put there. That's the Access Board who does that, who makes those decisions. And I talked to the Access Board. Oh. Hello, am I still with you guys?
There you go.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was moving. I talked to them, it was 2013. When I was working for the mayor, and let them know. So they know about it and they've set it up and everything, but you would have to talk to them. But that is a big project because those bike lanes are already set in place. So you would have to get buy-in from your planners, your community, and your community. If I were you, I would start with the community first, right? Your community. And once I talked to bicyclists they were like, oh, I never thought about this. They kind of got on board. And if you get your bicyclist advocates and activists together, then go to your planning people, that's a process I would do. But understand and know, that's a big, then also, so you know what happened in Queens? The only reason we got the street in Queens, it's in Jamaica, Queens, was because they were going to pave the street. And it's a large street. It's like a 4-lane kind of highway in Queens. And it's the same with the ADA. If your building is built before 1990, you don't have to be accessible. But the moment you go to renovate it or do something to it, you got to make it accessible. So that's what happened with that road in Queens. They went to refurbish it, and we hit them and we said, oh, you can make the bike lanes accessible. And they were like, okay, yeah, you're right. So that's how we did it there. But that's a big job. And I'll just say this, moving forward, if anyone wants to put up new bike lanes in your areas, you need to say it. They need to be accessible.
I will say one of the questions that's come up in a couple of the sessions in the summit is how to bring together ADA transition plans and walk bike plans. And this seems like a great thing to tackle, is what is the actual accessible width that you want to build into your system going forward.
Yeah.
And I hate to cut it off, and I know folks might have other questions, but I have to keep us on time. So I want to remind people about our next session today, which is reimagining the Safe Routes to School system. That's at 4 o'clock Pacific time. And then there's a networking and happy hour at the end of the day at 30-hour time. It's a little late for you, Dara, but hey, if you want to come back, hang out. And then in the chat, there's a Google feedback form for folks to comment about this session. And Dara has kindly put her email into the chat too, if you want to continue to reach out. So with that, oh, that's right, she'll be at the congressional baseball game tonight. Oh, darn. I bet our thing is more fun.
It sure will be, but yes, and I put my name, please reach out to me. I also saved the chat box, so if there's questions, I can answer them. But thank you all for this. Thank you for your work, and keep doing it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take care. Bye all.